Gender and Sexuality. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the annual Distinguished Faculty Lecture. This is a lecture series that features University of Chicago faculty who embody the spirit of critical feminist inquiry that characterized the work of Iris Marion Young, who was a professor in political science here and a critical member of the CSGS faculty board. So I'm very excited to welcome our 2019 speaker, Professor Jennifer Wild. Professor Wild is an associate professor in cinema and media studies. Her work focuses on modernism, the avant-garde, and experimental cinema. She's the author of the book, The Parisian Avant-Garde in the Age of Cinema, 1900 to 1923, from the University of Chicago Press, as well as, I'm sorry,
California.
I just assumed it was, I'm so sorry.
I know.
University of California Press, and many journal articles and critical book essays. Professor Wild's contributions to CSGS are innumerable. Most notably, she's served as Director of Studies for the last 3 years, where she worked tirelessly to build more gender curriculum into the MAPS and MAPS program and really energized our undergraduate major. In addition to the many exciting courses she teaches at CMS, she teaches a very popular undergrad course for us with Laura Jansen, our residential fellow, called Media Wars. And she also ran a faculty project at CSGS on counter cinema for several years. And I have to say that my first introduction to Jennifer was at a board meeting where she said she was going to bring a documentary about the punk group L7. And as a new professor, I thought, oh my God, I finally found my people on my so, I'm very excited for this opportunity to hear about her new work. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jennifer Wild.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for people who are standing. There are more places up here in front, so don't be shy. So thank you for the introduction. And thank you to everybody involved, especially Kristen Schilt, in selecting me to give this year's Iris Marion Young faculty lecture, which is truly an honor. I want to take this opportunity also to specifically thank our former director, Linda Zrilli. Hi, Linda. Who, about 10 years ago or so, when I was a new nervous assistant professor, drew me into the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality with her long arm and tight grip. Although at first I was a little hesitant just because I was still, trying to figure out my way through the University of Chicago and teaching and research and administration, Linda persisted. And ever since I directed my first project, Counter Cinema, Counter Media, here at the center, thanks to Linda's encouragement, the center has become a place of enormous support for me, where I have found an incredibly strong community with whom I have a deep solidarity, my people, as we say. And the center has also become a really important alternative space apart from my department, where I could deepen my participation, work, and life on campus. And I can't emphasize that. I'd like to emphasize that a lot, actually, especially for those of you who are perhaps new to university. Gina Olson and Tate Brazos have, of course, been a vibrant part of my story here at the center. And so I want to thank them sincerely for all that they've done for me throughout the years, including organizing this talk and the reception that you are all invited to attend after. Thank you, both of you guys. And finally, I want to give a little shout out of thanks to Ashley Leitner. Is Ashley here? Did she make it? Anyway, Ashley, about 2 years ago, Ashley received support from the College Research Fellows Program to become my undergraduate research assistant, just as I was embarking on this particular research. Not only was Ashley's work in French primary materials extremely valuable, but her curiosity and questions, in fact, led me to really significant leaps in this project. Without Ashley, I'm not sure I would have the work here today, which is still in the process of being worked on. So lastly, I want to say that it's also been a real pleasure to read about the life and the work of Iris Marion Young, for whom this annual lecture is named. Being a humanist with specialization in European history and art history, European film and art history, and European history, I hadn't ever read Young. But I want to say as a gesture toward an introduction that her concepts of marginalization and cultural imperialism, which she discusses in Justice and Politics of Difference, really feel to me to be coursing through this talk, even though I don't use her or I don't mention her. But so I want to start with just 2 epigraphs by Young as a way to both honor her and situate my talk within the political terms that interest me regarding the very idea of how to see one man's body. So the first, and of course here she's talking a lot more about race than I will be talking about, and gender and a lot of other different things I won't be touching on, but these concepts are really bold, and I think they set a nice tone, I think, to this talk. Marginalization is perhaps the most dangerous form of oppression. A whole category of people is expelled from useful participation in social life, and thus potentially subjected to material deprivation and even extermination. Cultural imperialism consists in groups being invisible at the same time that it is marked out and stereotyped. Victims of cultural imperialism are thereby rendered invisible as subjects, as persons with their own perspective and group-specific experience. When the dominant culture defines some groups as different as the other, the members of those groups are imprisoned in their bodies. And they experience, in short, an epidermalizing of their world. An epidermalizing is the key here, the key term here that I think is so important. As I think you'll see. So my talk this afternoon actually comes from a new book project tentatively entitled Concrete Aesthetics, Materiality, Politics, and History in the Image, which aims to trace a lineage of aesthetic discourse and practice that foregrounds the materiality of the image as it related to the development of political and material aesthetics after photography. On the screen you see an 1871 photograph of a barricade taken during the Paris Commune. My conceit about such early photographs, which serves as an historical index of past insurgency and performative resistance, and which emerges as a rich repository for an exploration of political representation and material aesthetics by way of the new photographic image here in 1871, is that they provide a different vantage point from which to examine a range of artistic forms and discourses that evince materiality's centrality to the project of 20th century political art and its relationship to history. But beyond specific photos of barricades, which serve as my first study in the book, all the photographic objects that serve as case studies articulate a concept of historical time, deep time and also deep history, that is rooted in the material things that both define a particular political poetics or concrete aesthetics, as I'm calling it, of the image, as well as anchor the viewer's relationship to the expanse of historical reality contained within this poetics of the image. This is the case, I'll suggest today, of the image of one man's body, a body that is both the subject of this talk and a case study in the manuscript. So, for those of you in my field of cinema media studies, and for perhaps many of you who study French culture, this is an iconic body that belongs to an iconic classic film, which has been the subject of countless essays and books. The film is Jean Vigo's La Talente from 1934. Excuse me. The character's name here, pictured on the screen, is Père Jules, or Father Jules, who works as a second hand to the skipper of a barge called La Talente. And this barge serves as the main setting of the film as it cruises along the canals and finally docks in the French capital. Now, the particular attributes of Père Jules' body that interest me, seen clearly here in a photograph taken on the production site, are his tattoos. As many of you know, those of you who know the film, as many of you know, the moment Père Jules unveils his body to reveal his inked skin is the subject of perhaps one of the most famous and, dare I say, fetishized sequences in French film history. For the sake of time, I'm going to show you only what is most important for me in a rather long 6-minute sequence in which Père Jules, played by the renowned actor Michel Simon, disrobes for Juliette, played by Dita Parlo. And Juliette here is the wife of the head skipper, Jean. And this sequence takes place, not incidentally, right after they arrive in Paris. Okay, let's see. Is there a full screen? Up here. Okay, so this should have sound. Do you hear it?
Ah, ça c'est marrant. Madame, dites-moi rien de prendre là. Qu'est-ce que c'est que ça? C'est ça? C'est vrai? C'est là. Ouais. Vous voyez? Non, là. Ah, le tatouage. Ah, oh, c'est des tatouages. Ou bien, c'est.
That's the crux of it, right? And as you saw, there are other elements which make this sequence very tantalizing. So without summarizing every scholarly analysis of this scene or La Talente, we might say that film history has broadly consigned the figure of Père Jules to the domain of the lowest working and social classes, marked as he is by his subordinate position on the vote and his ineloquent speech, his street speech. At the same time, film history has also enrobed him with the forces of popular spectacle and what some have called the visual magnificence and mystery of his personal cabin, which is filled with bizarre objects and curiosities, as you saw briefly. Insofar as the sequence also stages Juliet's clear fascination for the array of exotic and macabre items in Père Jules' cabin and for his tattoos, scholars have more often than not framed Père Jules' bodies as simultaneously legible and illegible, as ordinary and extraordinary. They have thus primarily aligned his body with the surrealist aesthetic of the marvelous and the uncanny. As one scholar writes, how can Juliet resist aesthetically and epistemologically this dancing collage of cuts and drawings, names and scars, places and graffiti? It's as if he were projecting an avant-garde travel film directly onto his body for her eyes only. This is not, as you might anticipate, how I want to read this body. For the remainder of my talk today, I want to reread his body and the distinct revelation of his tattoos as the film's, and thus as the director Jean Vigo's, acknowledgement of not simply a dark passage in the history of the French Empire, but a history of institutional violence and its effects that, in the early 1930s, was still coming to light within the larger popular sphere. This passage concerns the use and widespread abuse of penal colonies that were conceived and used during the Ancien Régime. Sorry, I forgot that one. And that became a formal component of penal law during the Revolution, which inaugurated a period of mass political deportation to, among other places, prisons located in the French colony of Guyana. The specific site of Guyana, where we find the infamous Devil's Island that famously harbored, among others, Alfred Dreyfus, became further established and formalized during the Second Empire under Napoleon III. Now, a significant part of this history concerns the military's use of penal colonies for a group they described as corps spéciaux, or special corps, that included, military and eventually common and even young petty criminals consigned to the bataillons d'infanterie légère d'Afrique, or the bataillons of light infantry of Africa, that were established in the early 19th century in order to reform the military. In common parlance, these disciplinary units were called the bat def, or in slang, the joyeux, the joyous, whose members served their sentence most commonly working hard labor in the biribi, a general word for what historian Dominique Khalifa calls the penal archipelago situated in North Africa, but which also extended to the South American colony in Guyane. With the 1890 publication of Biribi, Military Discipline by penal colony survivor Georges Darien, the French public got its first account of the mental and physical punishment and abuse meted out by the French army. By being situated outside of the hexagon, the penal colonies, or biribi, or what were otherwise called the dry guillotine, since it cuts not swift, not fast. So being situated outside the hexagon, these places were organized and controlled by the principle of psychological and geographical detachment, and as simultaneously real and imaginary spaces, as Khalifa suggests. The penal colonies operated as a widespread form of marginalization insofar as the transportees or transported were extracted from public view, making their invisibility or civil death part of the punitive totality. And at the same time, the experience of the Bat-Daf soldier prisoner, as well as other forced laborers in the colony of Guyana, were particularly visibly epidermalized, to recall Young's term, which of course she uses mostly in reference to race. And while race does play, of course, a very significant part in the history of penal colonies, it's a factor I can't explore today. The heavily tattooed body, nevertheless, in France, circa 1934, would have had a very potent signification for cinema-goers. That is, insofar as Père Jules' tattoos would have clearly signified his identity as a sailor, as most scholars have remarked, they would have also served as a warning sign. As the authors of the 1950 book Tatouage du Milieu, from which I draw this image on the right, and I quote, "Today in France, the presence of a tattoo on an individual can be interpreted as a suspect sign. Putting aside the tattoos from professional apprenticeships still worn by some older men, we mean the regiment tattoos, and in general all tattoos executed during military service, in which we find a particularly high number of men having served in the Marines or colonial troops. Even in these latter cases, the tattoo witnesses an individual's passage in a disreputable milieu. For all the other cases, we can consider, without much risk of error, that it is a sign of current belonging within or a passage through le milieu, the milieu." So hopefully it is clear to you that the milieu here is a vague term for a rough and rather dubious background of criminality. And I'll say too that, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this or if I skipped over this, but these authors are really situating their study between the late 19th century and 1950. So now there are many moments in La Talent's narrative that would support the idea that Père Jules, far more than simply being a salty old sailor, was in fact a subject of colonial penal practices, quite possibly having been transported as a member of the Bat-Daf for a crime he once committed. In the full sequence I showed you, for example, we come to understand that Père Jules has likely sailed to many countries collecting his objects, and at other moments he speaks of only knowing Black Africa as he engages in a mock African dance. And I think we can see here from this decor also, which again has been attributed mostly to a kind of surrealistic impulse, that we see a kind of range of other bodies of artifacts and images, potentially kind of bones and collections that serve his travels, and that may describe a kind of experience traveling with the Bat-Daf. However, the point of this exercise is not about narrative, or about filling in the holes that would allow us to explain Père Jules' identity or past. Rather, the exercise, or experiment, as I mentioned in the title of my talk, is about historical perception, and ultimately how Jean Vigo uses Père Jules' body to construct an image of the expansive historical reality of subjugation, punishment, and torture that the individual subjects of the bagne or the penal colonies endured. With this political historical poetics of the image, Vigo does more than humanize the underclass subject, as so many directors working in the French poetic realist style of the 1930s were keen to do. Rather, Père Jules' body is a visual site where Vigo develops an historical temporality associated with his concept of a social cinema. In 1930, Vigo proclaimed that this was the only worthwhile kind of cinema for how it held the spectator with a powerful grip, and more importantly, for how it effectively killed, and I quote, "our spinelessness, which makes us accept all the monstrosities committed by the men dropped upon the earth," end quote. To see Père Jules' body in Vigo's terms is to see beyond the anachronism of our own spectatorial gaze in order to confront or to be confronted with both historical time as part of the image's material or matter, and the power this material has in reorienting the political work or vocation of art, film, and the image to making once invisible historical realities perceivable, if not fully visible. This is this quote, "I can no longer stand myself. The bagne has entered me. I am no longer a man. I am a bagne." So in 1923, French journalist Albert Londres traveled to French Guiana to write an in-depth series of articles on its infamous bagne, or penal colony located in Cayenne. The series was published in Le Petit Parisien in serial style between August and September 1923, whereupon it made a resounding impression on French citizens. For it was, in fact, the first 20th century public account of the horrors of the penal colony. There was a previous one that was published earlier in 1890, which I think I mentioned. So Londres' work became a central part of the public debate about these penal practices. And this work included an open letter of protest to the Minister of Colonies, and suffice it to say, for sake of time, that Londres' reporting was an important part of the end of penal colonial practices that occurred in 1939, even if many of those prisoners were never repatriated or had to wait until the 1950s to set foot in France once again. I believe it was 53 were the last forçats or forced workers set foot from Cayenne into the Hexagon. So while Londres' on-location reporting style would come to be understood as a watershed moment in the early history of investigative journalism in France, he also actively fought for the emancipation of the wrongly convicted, who spent years, if not decades, laboring as forçats, or forced laborers. The etymology here is slaves, or languishing in solitary confinement in le cachot, or the hole. Such was the case of Paul Roussan. Born in 1885, he was condemned to 20 years of forced labor in 1908 for contemptuous and unlawful acts, as well as arson. However, during the first 14 years of his sentence, he was subsequently condemned to 3,779 days of solitary confinement for both banal acts and those associated with his increasingly radical taste for self-flagellation and extreme acts of cutting and self-mutilation. A thoroughly Sadian stance he developed in no small measure as a means of both surviving and revolting against the system from within its depths. Albert Londres, after leaping through Roussan's enormous file at Cayenne, came upon a list of a number of his actions that landed him in the hole. Quote, "He excited his comrades to hilarity by his constant chatter during nap time, 30 days in solitary. Complete destruction of his prison wear, 30 days in solitary confinement. Categorically refused to be put into shackles, 30 days in solitary confinement. Categorically refused to be unshackled, 30 days in solitary confinement. Forced open his cell service hatch, passed his head through and screamed, 'Another punishment, please!' 30 days in solitary confinement." These were the acts and conditions that, at only 38 years old, having spent 15 of those years in Le Bagne, prompted Roussan to claim that he was no longer a man, but a bagne. Jean Vigo, it turns out, had a profound interest in the penal colonies and the work of Albert Londres. A year before making La Talente, Vigo had planned with his producer Jacques-Louis Nunez to film a script adapted from Londres' 1923 exposés and his renowned defense of Eugène Dieudonné, the subject of his book from 1928 on the screen, on the right of the screen. So Dieudonné, Eugène Dieudonné was a forçat or forced laborer who escaped the bagne of Cayenne after being wrongly convicted of anarchist activity, and who Londres fought extensively for Dieudonné's release. The scriptwriters for Vigo's film are in fact listed as Dieudonné himself and a mysterious Jules Dupont, whom scholars believe to be Vigo's pseudonym. So Dieudonné and Vigo likely met within the anarchist circles of Vigo's father, who went by a pseudonym, Miguel Almerida. that he adopted after a stint in prison in 1900 for his far-left political activities. This virulent political activist was subsequently imprisoned in 1917 on the charge that his anarchist newspaper, Le Bonnet Rouge, was pro-German in its stance. The apex of what was known then as the Duval or the Bonnet Rouge affair came when Elmedira's body was found suicided in his cell, his shoelaces tied around his neck. And it goes without saying that Vigo, as well as his father's contemporaries, never believed that this was a suicide, but rather that his death was a political murder. So Évadé du Bagne, or the Escape from the Bagne, as Vigo's film was to be called, was undoubtedly a personal enterprise that, as scholars have pointed out, put Vigo in touch with his anarchist roots and the fond memory of his father. It was also an exercise in on-location shooting in Guyane, or was supposed to be an exercise in on-location shooting in Guyane, upon which Vigo insisted, for, as he explained, filming on site was the only way to capture the vibrant nature and experience of Dieudonné. Furthermore, it was the only way to convey a sense of the Bagne, which was not allowed to be photographed or filmed in any way. So, for the sake of time, I can only explain that Évadé du Bagne was never made, despite the elaborate and detailed script which had been approved by his producer, Nunez. The reasons for abandoning the project after some quite serious pre-production planning have to do with Nunez's fear of financial loss and censorship. His fear was, of course, well-founded. Vigo's 1933 film Zéro de Conduite, or Zero for Conduct, produced by Nunez, was banned by the Censorship Commission for depicting subversive content in its fictional uprising of young boarding school boys. Some historians have surmised that the memory of Vigo's father may have clouded the government's judgment regarding Zéro de Conduite. Nevertheless, Nunez scrapped production on Évadé du Bagne and insisted Vigo make La Talente instead. So with this specific history in place, I will suggest that despite his disappointment at the failure of this plan to make a film about the Bagne de Guyane and Dieudonné, Vigo turned to his concept of a social cinema in order to channel the history of state punishment and survival through the body of Père Jules and his tattoos. As he wrote in his manifesto, Toward a Social Cinema, this cinema provided the viewer with the reciprocal capacity to, quote, see our ingenuousness, which turns to cowardice in contact with a world which we accept, this world of exaggerated prejudices, of self-denials, of pathetically quixotic regrets, end quote. An achievement of such magnitude could not be had by purely formal or poetic means, according to Vigo, but only with a savage approach to poetry that exposed the societal frame guiding the relationships between individuals and things, as he said. Insofar as social cinema engaged a subject matter that forcefully stimulated desire for the cinema, as he argued, thereby opening a new and powerful relationship with the spectator, above all, these subjects, as Vigo wrote, ate meat. These social subjects, they ate meat. With this fleshly metaphor, Vigo advanced a political aesthetics that traded in the material relations of the human being within a social frame. So, in order to better understand Vigo's approach to the savage poetry of his images in La Talente, we would be right to return to the images of Père Jules, and to a moment before he disrobes, when he famously performs an act of self-mutilation, just when he spontaneously slices open his hand using the navaja that he claims to have acquired in Spain. While this cut has been interpreted as a corporeal sign or gesture for the extended, if not so covert seduction and sexuality that sustains this sequence, I understand Père Jules' self-inflicted cut is also the degree zero of the tattoo. So as I begin to conclude, I want to take us in a bit of a different direction in order to think a bit more theoretically about the historical temporality of the image of Père Jules' body and the material and historical matter that underlies all of his tattoos, but perhaps most potently the acronym MAD. As I began my talk, I framed my project here and more broadly as an inquiry into the image's capacity to harbor historical time. A deep time or history that speaks by way of the material things in the image, which both open up a political poetics of 20th century art and that grip the spectator, as Vigo would say, in order to anchor the spectatorial relationship to the layers of historical reality that is the power of this poetics. So the philosopher Jacques Rancière identifies a similar 20th century poetics as the pictorial possibilities of nature and naturalism, first elaborated by Schelling, Schlegel, and Michelet. This poetics, he writes in Figures of History, and I quote, is quite specifically dedicated to revoking the principle of the indifference of matter. It identifies the power of the work of art and of history as a bringing to light of the capacity for form and idea immanent in all matter, end quote. Further, he suggests this poetics can be tracked in an array of 20th century artworks that use defiguration to examine the historical but repressed truths about war, for example. In this slide, we see one of his examples, a painting by German artist Otto Dix, wherein the figural density of World War I soldiers merges with the landscape, bringing about a recognition not only of the corporeal weight of their bodies as they arguably huddle in a trench, but of the defacement of human dignity and what amounts to the obliteration of the divide between human body and earthly matter. This is an indictment of the material ends of war, whereby the human being, his or her flesh, is turned simply to natural matter on par with trees, rocks, or crevices in the earth. Defiguration, according to Rancière, quote, establishes one of the main processes by means of which the art of the 20th century was to catch up with history, namely the play of metamorphoses, through which what is represented, matter and form, change places and exchange their powers, he writes. So not unlike Dix's painting, which was indeed contemporary with Vigo's film, the image of Père Jules' body stages an encounter between matter and form, whereby the form of his life force inhabits the dead or inert traces of the past that are inscribed on his skin as, indeed, historical matter. The metamorphosis operating in Père Jules and Vigo's poetics, I suggest, bears witness not only to his skin as matter, it also expresses an emancipatory promise through the very concept of a poetics of historical time. Rancière writes, historical time is not just the time of great collective destinies. It is the time where anyone and anything at all make history and bear witness to history. The time of the promise of emancipation is also the time when any skin proves capable of manifesting the radiance of the sun, and any body is allowed to enjoy that sun in its own time and to bring out that enjoyment as a testament to history. Père Jules' own emancipated enjoyment of being seen with all of his tattoos and of performing for Juliet are more precisely moments wherein what is represented, matter and form, change places and exchange their powers. Far from being an indifferent sign for the underworld life of a sailor or his libidinal impulses liberated from the cultural contract of marriage but ensconced in this very domestic situation on the boat, Simon's body in this paradigm is an image of historicity, and importantly, of the double life of 20th century matter that capably harbors both life and the violent, nefarious, and troubling truths of the French historical past. So as I conclude, please allow me to briefly pause on two final images. The first is undoubtedly the most potent, and also the most sexually explicit. Now, sexual content and even vulgarity when it comes to tattoos, as historians of this period, like Khalifa, have noted, were quite normal. We're prime quality of the imagery, and it's a fact that necessarily speaks to the homosocial or homosexual milieu of men belonging to the Bat Daf or being together in one of the penal colonies and on the labor force there, forced labor. With the juxtaposition of these two images, with both of them, or I say all three, sorry, there was actually only one before, but now there are two. So there are three images, so we compare the two blocks. With the juxtaposition of these images, which all anthropomorphize the lower, more base regions of the body with tattooed facial signs, we might recognize the amplified sexuality of Père Jules' gesture when he places a cigarette into his navel to titillate and entertain Juliet. His gesture is not only clearly generated from a past experience, but it is also resonant of the possible sexual frustration, imagination, and identity of Biribi subjects, or banya subjects that are witnessed in the photographs on the left. We can only imagine what a cigarette would add to these big figures' performance, especially if it were for a female patronne of a boat upon which he worked as a former Bat-Daf soldier following his penitentiary period. The second image I'd like to offer you is a little bit tamer. It might in fact strike you as rather charming, even as it exists as a haunting index of another life culled from the annals of early 20th century French penitentiary history. This image depicts another Bat-Daf soldier prisoner whose tanned face and pale torso indicate a life working outdoors, either during or after his life in the banya. While his upper chest is marked by tattooed images of women, perhaps family members, lovers, or imagined figures of the female kind, his belly figures a portrait of Charlie Chaplin, enacting his famous dance of roles which he performed in the 1925 film The Gold Rush. With the tattoo's information, we can most certainly date the photograph, or at least approximately date the photograph. But can we speculate on how it posits a reversal between matter and form, as Rancière suggested in Figures of History? At the least, we might say that here, the matter of the soldier's body bears witness to the cinema's history and to the promise of emancipation that Chaplin's form provided all classes of all bodies, allowing each of them to display their enjoyment as a testimony to the power of this history. This enjoyment and emancipation of the body, and the body's historical visibility, I argue, is also the historical matter of how we should from now on see Père Jules. Thanks. Comments, insights. I will say that there have been, throughout the course of this research, there are so many moving parts, and this was a kind of effort to bring some of these things together in a way that need to be elaborated more and fleshed out more in the longer chapter. So I'm also really open to your critiques, into your insights into any part of this talk. Yeah.
I'm curious about Juliette's curiosity about his body. I was wondering if you could say, if you have anything to say about that. She's seeking this out.
Yes, she is. And, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about that because, of course, and I've been, just as an aside, I've been sort of chastised for not really dealing with her in the sequence. And, I do deal with her. But that curiosity is so interesting because, on the one hand, all of these people on the barge are lower classes. They're barge workers, right? And the film starts, in fact, when she gets married and she gets trotted off in her wedding dress to the barge, where she will then live her domestic and marital life. So all of these people are lower class, and this is, again, as I mentioned in the talk, a kind of feature of poetic realism. It really pays attention to subjects that weren't, of this sort of importance, say, in a traditional kind of way. But when I think about Juliette's fascination and the lack of her fear, especially upon seeing him with all of his tattoos, which may have gone a little bit unsaid in the talk, but which I believe spectators really would have understood this. That this is a body with historical matter that once he disrobes, it becomes very potent to that historical audience. Her lack of fear potentially gives us, and her way of also interacting with Père Jules, actually potentially show us where she's from. That she may even be from, it might give us insight about the depth of her class, the lower depths of her class, or her adjacency to a class that's that's either accustomed to, or a milieu that's accustomed to engaging with folks with a criminal background. I mean, there's also this moment that I couldn't show you where they sort of play on the bed and they roll actually the screen, the shot of this is a sort of production still from a moment where he kind of glides over her in the bed and she moves, and there's it's a really charged moment of playfulness, of sexuality and playfulness. And I mean, this is attraction, right? So there's a way in which she doesn't have those boundaries that her husband has in some ways, because he's always deriding him. He's deriding Pierre Jules. He's not curious. But I have thought about this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. That's
I thought this was an absolutely brilliant analysis. And my question has to do with what we did not see here, given that the books on tattoos, everything that you did to historicize this image had to do with the French colonial context.
Yeah.
And while there was a deep awareness in Vigo and everything that you said over the course of your talk about class and a particular kind of classed body, I wonder if, and this goes back to your initial reference to Iris Young, I mean, if you can read back some of colonialism's racial politics back into this body of cinema.
That's in some ways the plan. And this is in some ways, I mean, on the one hand, this history of penal colonies, of the Bat Daf, right? This bataillon of light, which was in fact a group of criminals who had either been, imprisoned in the military, or who had been convicted before being conscripted. So are all tied up with the penal system, in France. And of course, those units were developed not just to reform the penal system, but to build the colonies. I mean, all this forced labor, right? You go to Guyane, what are you doing? You're basically building roads. You're basically, forced labor. So it's not that I struggle with it, but there is a kind of experience of the French colonial subject, I think, is what I'm arguing. That these men and women and young boys who were potentially pickpockets, minor criminals, by the 1920s would be thrown onto a boat and sent to Guyane for,
Right.
So I want to address that because I think it's very much a part of the empire and of the colonial history of the empire. And yet I feel as though the marginalization here that's at work in this chapter is about the French subjects who were subjugated and controlled and tortured at the hands of this same arm that did the same thing to colonial subjects. So I don't know if that makes a balance. It's not an equal. There's not an equal thing here. They're not the same. But this chapter is, it's sort of, I think there's a tension between all this history and then the image and the film and the piece of art, which I want to, put together, which I think is also maybe what you're sensing is like the tension that's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this talk. Thank you. Well, I think there are three, they're probably separate questions, I'm not sure. I mean, the first one had to do with reception that you started to address in your response to Rachona. Like, would people watching this have recognized that this is a person who was in a French penal colony? And so that's like one, like how would they actually interpret the image? The second is really about, we were talking about social cinema, okay? Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about that in relation to, like, for example, Vigo, I'm not that familiar here, so, just so, like, does this film involve, or do other films involve the actual showing of life in a penal colony, or is this done strictly through like this imagery of the tattoos that bear the past, so to speak, the imprint of the past? And if so, then that's to me like an interesting question in terms of what that form of social cinema is trying to achieve and why maybe, I don't know, sort of like direct representation of, life in the penal colony, so to speak, would not do the same kind of work. So I thought maybe you could reflect a bit on that. And then the third question, which might be connected, is the relationship between form and matter. That, you know, I'm just theoretically, like, you know, I'm not exactly sure what you're doing with that. And so I just would love it if you could, you know, expand on how you see that relation to form and matter, and how, to go back into the second question, how the shift in that relationship involves a kind of change brought about by the social cinema that you are ascribing to.
So on the one hand, yes, just to kind of go in order, yes, I do. This is, you know, part of the work here is to not to scold cinema scholars for not having a kind of ability to see this, but that our scholarship still needs to go further in terms of these classic films, these, as I said, fetishized, overly studied. I mean, how many people have seen how many film people have seen La Solana? How many times have you seen it, right? We teach this film, we teach that sequence, we love it. But so it's also, my scholarship is also a way to return us to that historical spectator, because indeed, I mean, considering Albert Londres' very famous reportage, you know, the cache of materials that are being printed, detective magazine, criminal magazines that do have a focus on the penal colonies. I mean, the debates then that were taking place about the humanity, or the inhumanity of these places that, you know, were spearheaded in large part by Albert Londres. This was absolutely, I mean, just popular fodder, if you will. I mean, this would have been something, seeing Mav especially, but as well as his whole body. I mean, I think with the women, the nude women, the hand-drawn, you know, they're hand-done. So that absolutely, I do think that spectators would have had this as a kind of moment of recognition, had a moment of recognition vis-a-vis Père Jules' body. So, and I think that Vigo, because he couldn't make the film about Guyana, right? This was one of his strategies, I would say, where he is not just taking up, say, the form of this body, but he's using that matter, right, in a certain way. So it's not just content, right? It's flesh. It's flesh that so it's if you will, it's as though, and this is Rancière, he, you know, Vigo is thinking through. I mean, Rancière is perhaps, you know, channeling Vigo here, but that he is, I think, engaged with that similar reversal where it's no longer really the content that matters, or the form, it's the matter of the objects. Now, I'll get back to this. It's difficult. But also, there are very few films of the Banya because they weren't allowed to film there, much less take pictures. And so so one interesting thing to note is that in 1935, I think it is, Jacques Bernard Brunius, another member, kind of a fringe member of the Surrealist group, member of the October group, kind of radical theater person, he made a film called Évadé du Banya, so Escape from the Banya. And he used footage that was clandestinely shot, apparently by this Italian guy named Cesare Silviani, and that was smuggled back in. But then, so a lot of people think that Brunius kind of made the film that Vigo wanted to make, but it's actually a really much more complicated document because it's this quasi-fiction, you know, the rushes that he captured. It's very difficult, in fact, to tell what the actual scenes are that were taken in the penal colony. So part of this is that you couldn't see images, right? There were images of men in magazines, you know, in detective magazines or, you know, even Père Jules. But the actual conditions, I mean, there were perhaps drawings. The one film that I have encountered, it comes from 1939, and it's housed at one of the French Institutes for Archives. And again, it claims to be the first film ever filmed in Guyane, in Cayenne, in the penal colony there. And it's a complete piece of propaganda. you know, see how healthy they all are, you know, they're all, and of course, you know, the image speaks volumes, but it was definitely made for the state, especially in that moment when the penal colonies were then brought to or the practice of sending transportes to the colonies. So 1939, they finally open up the colony to being filmed, and it's very strange. It's a piece of property.
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
so how much of that was based on public awareness of what had been invisible? You know what I mean? In
That's
other words,
the
like just
point.
people, yeah,
Yes.
that's.
Yes,
you know,
I mean, there.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's.
No, I mean, and that's where, you know, I wanted to invoke Young, because it is in that invisibility, that notion of invisibility, where, and this is one of the reasons why this history is actually very difficult to track, and French historians correct me, but from what I've understood is that so much of the history that takes place in the colonies is out of sight, out of mind, right? So if it's not inscribed within the continental France, a lot of these histories, you know, this history especially is just not accounted for properly, and it's very confusing history. And what was your question?
Yeah, no, I was trying to figure out like the connection between like these representations,
Oh, yes.
these images, I mean, kind of making visible the invisible.
Yes,
what's
thank you,
actually being
thank you.
done in your name, right?
Yeah.
So.
No, absolutely, thank you.
yeah.
I'm sorry, I just had a
Yeah,
kind of.
that's fine.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so this out of sight, out of mind, you know, I can't overestimate Albert Londres' work. I mean, there was one book in 1890, I don't think I actually mentioned it, by Georges Darien, which was his account of surviving the penal colony, or escaping the penal colony, and that came out in 1890, and that was the first kind of push to bring recognition and some reckoning with the horrors of life on the penal colony. But Albert Londres in 1923, and it explodes. People are shocked, and I mean, you know, you can read them now as just in a regular published volume, and it's harrowing. I mean, what he describes, even just that small touch, the small description of this character Paul Housson. You know, there are accounts of him, you know, like I say, just he's covered in cuts, you know, and of course, as we know, this kind of cutting and self-mutilation is very much a prevalent practice in prisons today. But what he saw and what he described, of course, he drew some pictures, but he wasn't allowed to photograph. You know, to put it in a really casual way, it really rocked the French public in 1923, and you know, it really changed the course of the history of the invisibility, even if the invisibility continued until 1939. And I could think more about this history in matter and form, and it's very complicated, and it's part of the theoretical layer. But I can ruminate on that, so I can become more articulate. Yeah.
I just had one piece maybe for your archive if you haven't already thought of it, which is Zola's The Belly of Paris, which is about Florent, I think is the character's name, who comes back escapes from Devil's Island,
Right.
and takes up in this butcher shop. So
Yeah,
it
it's
just seems
great.
like a really kind of resonant
Absolutely.
image for you, where he kind of comes back, and there's that scene in particular, I think, where he's watching his, I don't remember, I think it's his sister-in-law, who's making blood sausage, and he has this sort of like deep kind of, you know, extended memory of this scene of cannibalism that he experienced while in the penal colony.
I see.
So it seems
Yeah.
like really kind of
It's
closely
so,
connected.
It's very closely
Yeah.
connected, absolutely. And it's certainly considering Zola's naturalism, and I confess I've not read that particular Zola, but
Yeah.
it's one I should read. I mean, we could think of Kafka, which is, it's not published until later, or it's not published in French until the later 30s, I don't think, in the penal colony, for example. But Zola's a better example, and I think that, you know, part of this work is, part of the rest of this work in some ways will be to suss out some other of these sources for how, even through literary means, there was an attempt at making something visible, or at least acknowledging that a human experience, a human butcher, right, might, that sounds really bad, a human being whose métier is a butcher, also has this past that uncannily relates to his métier, right, or something. But, and I'll say, just as a side note, this film from 1939 that was produced by the French government, they go around, because everyone in the penal colonies, they practiced many times their own métier, right? So what's interesting in the 39 films, they show a whole long sequence of a butcher, who is the butcher of the penal colony, and who is having his way with a very large piece of flesh. So not a bad, very cogent. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was actually wondering, as you were talking about the tattoos, I was thinking of the tattoo as the language of the body, as kind of opposed to the language, to the utterances of the main character. So I was thinking whether you can tell maybe a bit more about what's the role of dialogues in this movie. Do they come kind of to emphasize this tension, or to kind of add maybe another layer? Because I was surprised by how he doesn't describe, doesn't refer to the tattoos, while he refers to other, when he describes other items, he refers to Japan, to this kind of things. But when it comes to the body, it's like there's almost like silencing, and the body speaks.
The body speaks.
I was just thinking about like this kind of relationship between dialogue and the body.
No, it's a lovely point, and thanks for coming, by the way.
Yeah, thanks.
But absolutely, I mean, it's like this, the Philippe Artière, when he calls corps carnet, body notebooks. But this is, I'm thinking here, it's a really good point that he doesn't explain them, right? He just allows them to perform. And in some ways, I mean, you can almost hear the way he speaks, like in some of the poorly drawn kind of tattoos on his body. But this film is also an early sound film. So what are the role of the dialogues? I mean, that's a big question. I think if we were to look at this film, kind of telescope out and look at this film as a whole, it's very much about recording technology. There's a scene, for example, where Père Joual plays a record player, and there are all these things about music and recording technology and sound reproduction. So it's worthwhile to think about that. But I think you're right that there's definitely a way in which he doesn't need to explain where his tattoos come from, right?
It's very interesting when you talk about the origin of the project to bring forth to light something that was kind of familiar in that particular society. As this filmage continues, the society input critic reviews also change the filmage itself. Does the final ending affect a penal change? I think it was a combination of glamour and penal and colonialism. Does the final filmage suggest maybe a financial increase because of that marriage, that experience coming from the penal and things of that nature as society begin to comment and respond to the author?
Are you asking kind of about the narrative? Like, does the narrative allow
I study
Père Joual?
mathematics, not English, so please excuse
okay.
me, but I'm new to this subject as a hobby. When I listened to you, the author's original intent was to bring to light someone of a not so exposed class.
Yes, absolutely. And also this experience of potentially, well, the point is, I'm not trying to just say, oh, we should read Père Joual, now we understand him. It's more about thinking about his body as a placeholder, if you will, for a kind of, for historical reality. I mean, he's a fictional character. right? But the historical reality of the penal colonies, of the Bat Daf, of forced labor, all of that are I think housed in his body, sort of like compressed. I think of his body as like the compressed idea form of his failed film from Hien. You know, that he couldn't make this film, so he had to channel all of this energy. How did he do it? Thinking about a social cinema, which I didn't also talk too much about. He does that through this image of this body, bringing to light, like you say, but yet not also saying it. I mean, and this was Kali's point, is that he doesn't say it, right? He just allows the body to perform. And what I'm suggesting is that he performs this kind of this layered, complicated, very, very long history of penal practices. So, and maybe I didn't understand the follow-up to your question. But.
I think you responded with a fail, because I think you responded with a failed image. So after critically reviewing, it was just not an interest, not a taste, not so much that it was of taste. It was critically reviewed and accepted in the community, and also geared the change geared a revolution for those of that era.
You know, it's interesting. This film didn't do well financially at first, and actually, as you can see, this lovely slide I kind of omitted. It was originally called Le Chaland qui passe, or the sort of barge that passes along. And you see here in the poster, we have more of an emphasis here on Père Jules and his tattoos. And this is one of the original posters. But also there was a popular song that was promoted that came from the film. And you know, this is a kind of tactic of the early 30s to align, going back to this idea of music and early sound technology, to align music with the film. But it didn't do well as Le Chaland qui passe, so they sort of quickly renamed it La Talente, and it has probably a lot more important historical impact for the cinephiles of that period than a big audience. But it's nevertheless gone on to represent one of the sort of key texts in both Vigo's social cinema and in the poetic realist style, which, as I said, was really invested in bringing up to light, you know, subjects from the street. Yeah.
So at the end, can you put up the slide you had for Charlie Chaplin at the end, because you very
it was hard to find an ending to this particular talk. But
I was curious about what it represented about your thinking of the project overall, because it seemed to be saying that there was something about popular cinema and its inclusion, or something that was going. So I wanted to know what you were doing with the Charlie Chaplin, or if it was just a.
You know, I think it's just the idea that here I think it was more of a writerly flourish to try to
gotta watch the
merge the cinema and tattoos even further by, you know, reversing this, that he's a real man, but he's got this fake image of, well, he's got this tattoo of Chaplin, who is real. You know, I was trying to at least just evoke here, in using the image on the left, put us in front of an image that we recognize. I mean, Chaplin is recognizable, right? If it's part of his autobiography, his skin is this autobiographical, you know, topos, then we can identify that, just I think as we can identify MAV, or the spectators at the time could identify MAV as being as identifiable as Chaplin's saying. So, what was I saying at the end? I'm not sure. I was trying to get to the end. But you know, to me, it's an image that is resonant of how, it's just kind of poetic, maybe.
But it's political too, right?
It's political. Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was just being able to, if you were able to date the photograph, that might also indicate the kind of political leanings, because Chaplin meant different things at different times politically in France.
Yeah. I mean, I see that as sort of a cinephile tattoo. You know, I mean, at least we know it's from 25, so this is also a way of kind of thinking through that kind of history, and you're right, Chaplin was political, and I think what I tried to gesture to is that it probably didn't work here because I didn't talk about Chaplin a lot, but Chaplin is so important for a kind of, for that emancipatory cinema spectatorship. Just an absolute emancipation with laughter came at a very crucial time during World War I. So I think more than anything, I was trying to think through this claim of Rancière about this emancipation and about historical time as the time when everyone can feel the light of the sun on one's body and one is no longer invisible, right? So, so that was the sort of nexus that I'll probably revise. Thank you.
So we'll time for one more question.
Okay, Daisy?
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the documentary or evidentiary status of the body here. And I was particularly interested, not so much in the image where he's showing his front to Juliette, but the other one where he turns his back to the camera.
Yeah.
And where he becomes a kind of exhibit A.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
But of what? And so would that have been self-evident? Would that have been contingent upon a particular viewer's position? Like, what is it that we are supposed to be supplying with respect to this image?
Well, I mean, going back to this idea of the historical spectator, I mean, I just think that, you know, our anachronistic gaze, you know, we don't have this purchase on a visual history, popular cultural history, print, you know, print history of criminal tattoos, criminality, the symbols for criminality that I do believe would have been just absolutely part of the parlance, if you will, of the 1930s and 1920s in Paris, in France. That, so what are we supposed to bring to this? I mean, in some ways, this is a kind of, you know, it's an act of privacy here, where he turns his back, but it's also a kind of, you know, barricade. You know, there's something where he's both covering and revealing at the same time. You know, how much can we read? I mean, it's almost like that little face looks, I don't know, you know, what can we read? I mean, this is the question, right? But I think that there is enough going on on this skin. Again, I think a deeper reading would take into account all of the mise en scène and all of the postcards and images and posters and whatnot. But I think this amalgamation of things, I don't think that you'd have to, I mean, my conceit is that as a spectator of the time, you would know exactly, not exactly where he's from, but what, again, this idea of the milieu. That he's coming from the penal, either the penal colonial milieu or the Bat Daf, right, where he was sent to forced labor because he was imprisoned before and then was conscripted, or that he's been free of his labor, of his time, and that these are the marks to prove it. I mean, again, part of it's just the form of them, the handmade quality. And then again, we have to wonder what he's showing to Juliette, right, and what that stands for, which I think is a way that the film might also, you know, kind of conceal once again this other corporeal historical reality of his body's image. Does that?
Well, isn't the other part of it is that it's his body?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's particular. It's like on the one hand, the tattooed body represents what you said. It has this historical meaning of the visibility, now making visible something that's invisible. But there's a kind of specificity or particularity to his, like, tattoos, right?
Right.
Are very, I have no tattoos, so I have no idea. But, you know, I mean, people who have tattoos tell me that, you know, I mean, it's a very, you know, how to put it, it's individualizing, it's very particular, it's specific to that subject. So, I mean, it's not just a, like, having this person stand in for a whole class of people who have been shipped off to the colonies. Like on one hand, yes, but on the other hand,
no.
it's him. Like
It
it's
is
this
him,
person,
absolutely.
You know, not
Exactly.
just like him standing in for a member of a social class or something.
Right, and I
Like
mean,
both things at once.
and this is where, you know, as a humanist, it's like, you know, I wouldn't want to say that he's just the symbol, right, or this accretion for, but at the same time, I mean, this is how I'm sort of thinking through Vigo's strategy to make a film, A, he couldn't make, and B, you know, how to think through this particular character such that the film has a social agency, has a political agency. I mean, this was a script, it was given to him. It doesn't, by and large, have a lot of political content, if you will. I mean, we could talk more about that. But to your point of the individuality, absolutely. I would like to point out, nevertheless, some of the similarities of the tattoos. Now, I've been looking at a lot of these, but, you know, just for example, some of the, maybe this makes sense to you here, maybe it doesn't. I could show you other images, but you know, some of these forms and some of these figures are almost like a kind of a very common lexicon. And I think what La Casaña and his son later do in the 50s, I mean, they try to understand these as a language and as a shared language. And the one thing that the MAV does in particular is become a shared language. And I think that, so, you know, of all things, I mean, what are we supposed to do here? We're supposed to understand, it's him, but he shares a language. He belongs to a group, and he has a shared experience with a group, which is perhaps a nice way to end on, again, the evocation of Young.